Imagine you spend 5 years of your life building something. You work nights. You work weekends. You hire people. You burn through savings and investor money. You argue about features. You polish the interface until it gleams. And then, on launch day, you open the doors and nothing happens. Not failure in the dramatic sense. No lawsuit, no explosion, no scandal. Just silence. A product that works exactly as designed, sitting there, wanted by no one. That particular kind of heartbreak is more common than the startup mythology admits, and it is the wound at the center of this book. Eric Ries lived it. And the question he came away with was not the one most founders ask. Most founders ask, why did the market reject us? Ries asked something stranger and more useful. He asked, why did it take us 5 years to find out? That reframing is the whole engine of the lean startup. Because if the real disease is not failure, but the slowness of discovering failure, then the cure is not better planning, or better vision, or a bigger launch. The cure is a faster metabolism for learning. A machine that converts assumptions into evidence at high speed and low cost. What Ries proposed in 2011 was essentially an argument that entrepreneurship is a form of management, not the romantic opposite of it. That startups are not chaotic magic that either strikes or doesn't. That they can be run with a discipline as rigorous as accounting, as measurable as manufacturing, as iterative as science. It was a claim that sounded almost deflating at the time, and it turned out to be one of the most influential ideas in modern business. So, let's take it apart. What the method actually says, where the ideas came from, the examples that made them stick, and just as important, the places where thoughtful people have pushed back and said, careful, this doesn't apply everywhere. Eric Ries is an American entrepreneur who came up through the software world of the 2000s. Before he was an author, he was a founder and an engineer, and the formative experience behind this book was a startup that did not work, an experience he has described repeatedly not as a tragedy, but as an expensive education. The lessons crystallized at his next venture, an avatar-based social product, where he and his co-founders started doing things that felt, at the time, faintly embarrassing. They shipped software that was unfinished. They released to customers far earlier than their engineering instincts told them was decent. They watched what people actually did rather than what they said in meetings. And they discovered over and over that their most confident strategic assumptions were wrong in ways no amount of internal debate would have surfaced. Ries began writing and speaking about this approach, first through a blog and conference talks, and the ideas spread through Silicon Valley long before they became a book. He also worked as an advisor to other startups and to venture funds, which gave him something a single founder never gets, a wide sample. He could see the same failure patterns repeating across dozens of companies, which is what turned a personal survival strategy into something that looked like a general method. The book itself was published in 2011, with the subtitle describing how today's entrepreneurs use continuous innovation to create radically successful businesses. It debuted at number 2 on the New York Times bestseller list in the hardcover advice and miscellaneous category, and according to the publisher, it went on to sell more than 1 million copies and be translated into over 30 languages. That is unusual reach for a book that is, at its heart, about process discipline. It's worth naming the intellectual lineage because Ries is unusually open about borrowing. The word lean comes directly from lean manufacturing, the Toyota production system, with its obsession with eliminating waste, working in small batches, and stopping the line the moment a defect appears. The iterative rhythm comes from agile software development. And the customer-facing half owes a large debt to the customer development work of Steve Blank, who was Ries's teacher and mentor. What Ries did was fuse these traditions and aim them at a specific target, the condition of extreme uncertainty in which new ventures operate. The context of the moment matters too. In 2011, the cost of starting a software company had collapsed. Cloud hosting, open source, app stores, and online advertising meant that 2 people could launch to a global audience for the price of a laptop. That collapse in cost changed the optimal strategy. When building is cheap, the bottleneck moves from construction to knowing what to construct. Ries wrote the management book for that new bottleneck, and the timing is a large part of why it landed so hard. Rise opens with a definition that seems academic until you realize how much work it does. A startup, he says, is a human institution designed to create a new product or service under conditions of extreme uncertainty. Notice what is absent from that definition. There is no mention of size, no mention of garages or hoodies, no mention of technology, no mention of venture capital or equity or growth rates. Which means, by this definition, a team inside a 100-year-old industrial conglomerate launching a genuinely novel product is a startup. A government agency piloting a new service is a startup. A small business is not necessarily a startup if it is opening the 10th franchise of a well-understood restaurant concept, because the uncertainty there is ordinary business risk, not fundamental unknowability. This distinction is the hinge of the entire book. Traditional management is extraordinarily good at executing plans when the underlying model is known. You forecast, you budget, you set milestones, you measure variance against the plan, you hold people accountable for hitting it. That machinery is not stupid, it is the accumulated wisdom of a century of industrial practice, and it works beautifully when you know what you're building and for whom. It fails, Ries argues, precisely when the assumptions underneath the plan are themselves the thing in question. If you don't know whether customers want the product, a detailed 36-month plan is not rigor. It is elaborate fiction with a spreadsheet attached. And the tragedy is that it looks like rigor. It has numbers. It has confidence. It survives board meetings. Hitting the plan feels like success even when the plan itself was built on a fantasy. The word Ries uses for this is failure of the second kind, achieving failure. Successfully, faithfully, on time and on budget, executing a plan that leads nowhere. He argues this is the dominant way startups die. Not through sloppiness, but through disciplined pursuit of an unexamined premise. The other consequence of the definition is that entrepreneurship becomes teachable. If a startup is an institution operating under a particular condition, then there can be a management discipline suited to that condition, one that can be studied, transmitted, and improved. That claim is why the book ended up in university curricula. A 2019 article in The Conversation observed that it rapidly became a foundational text in entrepreneurship classes, which is a strange fate for a book born out of one person's expensive mistake. If achieving failure is the disease, validated learning is the proposed cure, and it is the single concept from this book most worth carrying around. Validated learning means demonstrating empirically that a team has discovered something true about the present and future prospects of the business. Not learning in the soft sense of gaining insight or having a productive conversation. Learning with evidence attached, a claim you were uncertain about, tested against reality, with a result you would have accepted either way. The reason this needs a special name is that startups are extremely good at generating the counterfeit version. A team spends 3 months building a feature nobody uses and then explains, with total sincerity, that they learned a great deal. And they did learn something. But they paid 3 months for a lesson that a 2-day test might have taught them, and the learning arrived as a consolation prize rather than the objective. Ries pushes this into an unsettling place. He argues that any effort not absolutely necessary for learning what customers want is waste. That is a genuinely aggressive standard. It means beautiful architecture is waste if it does not accelerate learning. It means a polished onboarding flow is waste if the underlying value proposition is still unverified. Engineers hate this, and they are not entirely wrong too, but the point is not that quality doesn't matter. The point is that quality is meaningless until you know what you are supposed to be building. Perfecting the wrong thing is the most expensive form of craftsmanship there is. The story he tells about his own company makes this concrete. The team was convinced that their product needed to work alongside the instant messaging networks people already used, because surely nobody would ask friends to adopt something new. They spent enormous engineering effort on that interoperability. It was hard, it was clever, and when they finally put the product in front of real people, it turned out the assumption underneath it was simply wrong. Users behaved in ways the team had not modeled at all. The months of integration work had been, in learning terms, close to worthless. What makes the anecdote useful is that the assumption was not foolish. It was reasonable. It was the kind of thing every experienced person in the room would have nodded along to. That is exactly the danger. The assumptions that kill you are not the ones you're worried about. They're the ones so obvious that nobody thought to write them down, let alone test them. Hence the practice Ries recommends. Identify your leap of faith assumptions explicitly. Usually there are two that dominate. The value hypothesis, will people find this genuinely valuable once they use it? And the growth hypothesis, how will new customers discover it and keep arriving? Write them down as falsifiable statements. Then design the cheapest possible experiment that could prove them wrong. The operational core of the method is a loop with 3 stages. Build a version of the product. Measure how customers respond. Learn from the data, and use that to decide whether to persevere or change direction. Then go around again. The loop sounds obvious, and stated that flatly it almost is. But Ries makes 2 observations about it that are not obvious at all. The first is about direction. You execute the loop building first, but you must plan it backwards. Start from what you need to learn. From that, derive what you need to measure in order to learn it. From that, derive the minimum you need to build in order to generate that measurement. Teams that skip the backwards planning end up building something, then hunting around for metrics that make it look good, then extracting a lesson that was decided in advance. That is not a learning loop. That is a rationalization loop wearing the same clothes. The second observation is about the objective. The goal is not to complete the loop well. The goal is to minimize the total time through the loop. This is a subtle but enormous shift. It means that when you evaluate a decision, a technology choice, a hiring decision, a process change, the right question is not is this good, but does this shorten the cycle? A slightly worse architecture that lets you ship in a week beats a beautiful one that takes a quarter, because the week-long loop lets you go around 4 or 5 more times in the same period, and each lap is an opportunity to stop being wrong. There is a compounding effect here that I think people underestimate. If your competitor learns once a quarter and you learn once a month, you are not 3 times better. You are running an entirely different kind of process, one that converges on the truth while theirs is still committing to its first guess. Over 2 years the gap becomes uncrossable, not because you were smarter, but because you were wrong more times, faster, in cheaper ways. This also reframes what speed means in a startup. Speed is usually understood as shipping features quickly. Ries redefines it as reducing the latency between a question and its answer. A team that ships constantly but never checks what happened is not fast. It is just busy at high volume. The most famous idea in the book, and the most abused. The minimum viable product is the version of a product that allows a team to complete one full turn of the build, measure, learn loop with the least effort and the least development time. The phrase gets misread constantly as meaning a cheap product, or a bad product, or a product with fewer features. That is not the definition. The M in minimum is not about ambition or quality, it is about the effort required to answer a specific question. Which means the right MVP for one question looks nothing like the right MVP for another, and quite often the right MVP is not a product at all. The examples that made this vivid are worth revisiting. A file-syncing startup faced a problem where building the actual technology was enormously difficult and demonstrating it was almost impossible, since seamless syncing looks like nothing happening. So instead of building it, they made a video showing how it would work and watched how many people signed up. The video was the experiment. The learning was real. The engineering was deferred until the question was answered. An online shoe retailer, before building any inventory system or warehouse, had its founder photograph shoes in local stores, post the pictures online, and, when someone ordered, go buy the pair at retail and ship it. Financially, this is a terrible business. You make no margin, possibly negative. But as an experiment it is superb, because it tests the one thing nobody knew: would people buy shoes online without trying them on? Every other question can wait behind that one. Then there is the concierge approach, where you deliver the service manually to a handful of customers, doing by hand everything the software would eventually automate. It does not scale, which is the point. You are not trying to scale. You are trying to find out whether the thing is worth automating, and manual delivery teaches you more per customer than any automated system ever will, because you see every wrinkle and confusion up close. and the version sometimes called the Wizard of Oz, where the customer believes they are interacting with a finished automated product and there are in fact humans behind the curtain doing the work. The interface is real. The magic is fake. The learning is genuine. Ries is honest about the emotional cost, and this is the part one find most useful. Shipping an MVP feels awful. You expose something incomplete under your name. Customers will be unimpressed, and some will say so in public. Your team's pride takes a hit. He argues you should expect this and push through, with one important caveat: early adopters are a different species from mainstream customers. They tolerate rough edges because they have the problem badly enough to want a partial solution. They will often even prefer something unfinished because it leaves room for them to shape it. If your MVP is polished enough for the mainstream, you probably overbuilt it. The failure mode to watch for is the MVP that tests nothing. If you cannot say, before you build it, which specific assumption it will confirm or refute and what result would change your mind, you are not running an experiment. You're just shipping a small product and hoping it goes well. Here is the problem that makes everything above hard to sustain. Suppose you have committed to iterating. How do you know if the iterations are working? Traditional metrics were designed for established businesses: revenue, profit, market share, return on investment. In a startup, all of those numbers start at approximately 0 and stay there long past the point where meaningful progress is happening. You need a way to demonstrate that learning is occurring before the financial results show up, or the whole approach collapses into faith. Ries calls the answer innovation accounting, and the enemy it fights is what he memorably named vanity metrics. Vanity metrics are the numbers that go up and make everybody feel good and tell you almost nothing. Total registered users, cumulative downloads, page views, press mentions. Their defining characteristic is that they are gross totals, which means they can only ever increase, which means they always tell a story of progress regardless of whether the business is healthy or dying. A chart that cannot go down is not a measurement. It is decoration. The alternative is cohort analysis. Instead of asking how many users do we have in total, you group customers by when they arrived and follow each group separately. Of the people who joined in March, what fraction completed sign-up, came back the following week, invited a friend, paid? Then the same for April and May. Now you can see whether the changes you shipped in April actually improved anything, because you are comparing like with like. The absolute numbers might all be small. The trend between cohorts is the signal. Alongside that, split testing, running 2 versions simultaneously with different customers and comparing results. Ries argues this is worth doing more often than teams think, including for features everyone is certain about, because the certainty is exactly what is untested. He notes something amusing and slightly damning about split tests. They frequently reveal that features the team argued about for weeks make no measurable difference at all, which is itself valuable because it tells you where the leverage is not. He offers 3 criteria for a useful metric, and they are easy to remember. Actionable: it must demonstrate clear cause and effect, so you know what to do differently. Accessible: everyone on the team should be able to understand it without a data analyst translating, and ideally see the actual people behind the numbers. Auditable: you must be able to trace the number back to real customer behavior and check that it is not an artifact of how the report was built. Metrics that fail these tests become political instruments rather than instruments of learning. The larger purpose of innovation accounting is that it makes a startup's progress legible to outsiders, to investors, to a corporate parent, to a board. If you can show that the conversion rate for each successive cohort has improved through a series of deliberate experiments, you have evidence of a functioning learning engine, even with negligible revenue. That is a real contribution. It gives patient capital something rigorous to be patient about. Eventually, the accounting delivers uncomfortable news. The experiments are running properly, the team is tuning diligently, and the numbers are improving by amounts too small to ever reach a viable business. Ries's term for this state is the gap between where you are and where the plan said you would be, and when the gap will not close through further tuning, the answer is a pivot. His definition is precise and worth holding on to. A pivot is a structured course correction designed to test a new fundamental hypothesis about the product, strategy, or engine of growth. Structured, because it is not panic. Testing a hypothesis, because it is not merely a new idea, it is a new experiment. And fundamental, because changing a button color is not a pivot no matter how the press release describes it. Crucially, a pivot keeps one foot on the ground. You retain what you have validated and change what you have not. The company that discovers its users only care about one small feature and rebuilds around that has zoomed in. The company that finds a single feature is insufficient and expands to a broader offering has zoomed out. There are pivots that keep the problem but change the customer, pivots that keep the customer but change the problem, pivots on the revenue model, pivots on the sales channel, pivots on the underlying technology, pivots on the growth engine itself. Rise catalogs about 10 varieties, and the catalog is useful mainly because it stops teams from thinking of a pivot as a binary quit or continue, when it is actually a menu of specific, partial changes. The observation that has stayed with me most is his claim about timing. Almost every entrepreneur who pivots says afterwards that they wish they had done it sooner. Almost none say they pivoted too early. That asymmetry should tell us something about how the decision feels from inside. Why is it so hard? Rise names 3 forces. First, vanity metrics provide cover. As long as some number is going up, you can defend continuing. Second, the absence of a clear hypothesis means there is nothing to falsify, so no evidence can ever be decisive. And third, plain fear. Pivoting is a public admission that the vision you sold to employees, investors, and yourself was not right. It threatens the founder's story about themselves. His practical countermeasure is almost mundane, which is why it works. Schedule a recurring meeting every few weeks or every couple of months, explicitly called the Pivot or Persevere meeting. Bring the product team and the business team. Review the cohort data and the experiments since last time. Ask directly whether the tuning is producing enough improvement to reach the goal. By making the question routine, you strip it of drama. Nobody has to be brave enough to raise it because it is already on the calendar. The third part of the book turns to a different question. Once you have a learning engine that works, how do you make it go faster without breaking it? This is where the manufacturing heritage shows most clearly. The central idea is working in small batches. There is a lovely illustration involving stuffing envelopes, the intuition that it's faster to fold every letter, then stuff every envelope, then seal every envelope turns out to be wrong in practice. Because of the handling and stacking and the fact that if the envelopes are the wrong size, you discover it only after folding 200 letters. Doing one envelope completely, then the next, finishes sooner and surfaces the defect on item 1 instead of item 200. Applied to product development, the batch is the amount of work that moves between stages before anyone sees it. A large batch, 6 months of features released at once, hides all its errors until the end, and when something is wrong you cannot tell which of the 100 changes caused it. Small batches let defects surface immediately and locate themselves. This is the reasoning behind continuous deployment, where changes go to customers many times a day, which sounds reckless and is in fact the opposite. The smaller the change, the smaller the blast radius, and the more precisely you can attribute what happened. Borrowed directly from Toyota is the notion of stopping the line, the cord any worker can pull to halt production when they see a defect, rather than passing the problem downstream. In a software team, the equivalent is an automated system that blocks a bad change from reaching customers and forces the team to deal with it before continuing. It feels like it slows you down. Over time, it speeds you up dramatically because you are no longer building on top of accumulated breakage. And then the technique I think is the most portable thing in the whole book, the 5 whys. When something goes wrong, ask why, then ask why of the answer, and keep going roughly 5 levels. A server went down, why? A bad configuration change. Why did that change get deployed? It wasn't tested. Why wasn't it tested? The engineer was new and didn't know the procedure. Why didn't they know? The onboarding process doesn't cover it. Why doesn't it? Nobody owns onboarding because we've been hiring too fast to maintain it. You started with a technical failure and arrived at an organizational one. That is the point. Ries argues that the 5th answer is almost always human, a training gap, an unclear responsibility, a missing process, and that most teams stop at the 1st or 2nd level, fix the surface. and get bitten again in a slightly different form 6 weeks later. He pairs this with a rule about proportionality. Make an investment in prevention proportional to the size of the problem. Small incident, small fix at each of the 5 levels. This prevents the technique from becoming a bureaucracy generator, which is its main failure mode. The other failure mode he explicitly warns about is the 5 blames, a session that degenerates into finding the person responsible. The moment that happens, people stop reporting problems honestly, and the whole mechanism dies. The rule he suggests is tolerance for first-time mistakes and never the same mistake twice. 2 more ideas round out the framework, and both concern what happens after you have something that works. On growth, Ries argues that sustainable growth comes from past customers driving the acquisition of new ones, and that there are essentially 3 mechanisms, 3 engines. The sticky engine runs on retention. You win if new customers arrive faster than existing ones leave, so the metric that matters is the churn rate, and the improvement lever is making people stay. The viral engine runs on customers bringing other customers as a natural consequence of use, and it lives or dies on whether each user brings, on average, more than 1 new user. The paid engine runs on spending to acquire customers, and it works only when the lifetime value of a customer exceeds what it costs to get them, with the surplus reinvested. The strategic insight is the discipline of focus. Each engine has its own dominant metric and its own set of improvements, and a team trying to optimize all 3 at once will do all 3 badly. Pick one. Tune it until it is genuinely exhausted. And note that a growth engine can run out. The tactics that worked at 10,000 customers often stop working at 1 million, which is one legitimate reason to pivot even when things appear to be going well. The other idea is that all of this can and should happen inside large, established companies, and this is where Ries stretches the book beyond startups. He argues that established firms have advantages founders would kill for capital, brand, distribution, customer relationships, existing supply chains, and one crippling disadvantage, which is that their management systems are optimized for predictable execution and will strangle an experiment on contact. His proposed remedy is the innovation sandbox. Define a bounded space where an internal team can run experiments, perhaps affecting only a small percentage of customers or only certain products or regions. Inside that boundary, the team gets real autonomy and is measured by innovation accounting rather than by conventional financial targets. Outside it, they cannot cause damage. Over time, if the experiments work, the boundary expands. The book cites real adoption of these methods at large organizations, including work at General Electric, and the approach has been used at companies such as Dropbox, Wealthfront, and Alphabet Energy. The 2011 book has also become, as a 2025 article in The Conversation described it, something used by millions of entrepreneurs worldwide. An honest discussion has to include the criticism, and the academic response has genuinely been mixed. Ethan Mollick, a professor at the Wharton School, has been broadly supportive of the emphasis on experimentation and learning while raising a pointed concern. The reliance on early customer input can mislead when the technology is genuinely novel. Customers can tell you a great deal about a problem they already recognize. They are far less reliable about a category that does not yet exist because they have no frame of reference to imagine it. Mollick has also noted limitations in the associated tools, such as the business model canvas. A 2019 article in The Conversation set out 3 situations where the model should not be applied. When prototyping carries very high costs or very high risks, think aerospace, pharmaceuticals, medical devices, heavy infrastructure, the premise of cheap, fast experiments simply doesn't hold. And the regulatory reality is that you cannot ship a minimum viable heart valve. When the cost of testing outweighs the benefit, which is often true for small, obvious decisions where you should just make a call and move on. And when the team lacks the experience to interpret the results, which is the quietly devastating one, a team running experiments it cannot read will confidently pivot in the wrong direction and feel scientific about it. Becken and Sneyer concluded that the process of experimentation remains under-researched and that academic understanding of it is limited. That is a fair statement about a framework built largely from practitioner observation rather than controlled study. And in 2020, A Harvard Business Review article characterized the book as having become a kind of Bible for business neophytes, which is at once a testament to its reach and a caution. Any framework that becomes doctrine gets applied without judgment. MVP becomes a permission slip for shipping something careless. Pivot becomes a respectable word for having no strategy. Data-driven becomes a way to avoid ever making a decision that requires taste or conviction. Ries himself is not naive about this. The book insists that vision comes first, that the method is a way to steer toward a vision rather than a substitute for having one, and that pivots preserve a direction while changing the route. But the caution deserves stating plainly, because the failure mode is common, a company that runs beautiful experiments and optimizes itself into a local maximum nobody actually cares about, having never made the one uncomfortable bet that would have mattered. Let me gather what I think is genuinely durable here. The reframe first. A startup is any human institution creating something new under extreme uncertainty, which makes this a management discipline rather than a genre of company. The condition, not the corporate form, determines which tools apply. The core failure mode is achieving failure, executing a plan flawlessly when the plan itself rests on an untested premise. Detailed long-range plans in a genuinely uncertain domain are not rigor, they are confidence with a spreadsheet attached. The unit of progress is validated learning, not features shipped or hours worked. If you cannot name what you learned and what evidence supports it, you did not learn, you spent. Build, measure, learn is executed forwards and planned backwards. Start from the question, derive the measurement, then build only enough to produce it. And optimize for the total time around the loop rather than the quality of any single lap. The minimum viable product is defined by the question it answers, not by how small it is. A video, a manual service, a human behind a curtain, a founder buying shoes at retail, these are legitimate MVPs, often better ones than actual software. Innovation accounting replaces financial metrics during the search phase. Use cohort analysis and split tests. Distrust every number that can only go up. Demand that metrics be actionable, accessible, and auditable. Pivoting is a structured change of a fundamental hypothesis while keeping what has been validated. Almost everyone waits too long. Put the decision on a recurring calendar so nobody has to be the brave one who raises it. Work in small batches so defects surface early and locate themselves. Stop the line when something breaks. And when you investigate, ask why about 5 times, because the real cause is almost always a human system rather than a technical one, and make the fix proportional to the problem so the practice doesn't calcify into bureaucracy. Growth comes from one of 3 engines: sticky, viral, or paid. Pick one, know its governing metric, and resist the urge to run all 3 at once. And finally, know the boundaries. Where prototyping is expensive or dangerous, where testing costs more than it reveals, where the technology is so novel that customers cannot meaningfully react to it, and where the team cannot interpret its own results, in those places, this method is the wrong tool, and applying it anyway is its own kind of achieving failure. The strange thing about the lean startup, more than a decade after publication, is how much of it has become invisible through absorption. MVP, pivot, iterate, validated learning. These words now sit in ordinary business conversation, often used by people who have never read the book and sometimes used in ways that would make Ries wince. That is what happens to ideas that win. They get flattened into vocabulary. Which is a good reason to go back to the argument underneath the jargon, because the argument is better than its slogans. It is this: uncertainty is not an excuse for the absence of discipline. It calls for a different discipline. Not the discipline of hitting the plan, but the discipline of being ruthlessly honest about what you know, what you merely believe, and what it would take to tell the difference. That is a harder standard than it sounds. It asks you to write your assumptions down where they can embarrass you, to design tests you might lose, to look at data that contradicts a story you have been telling investors for a year, to treat your own conviction as a hypothesis rather than an identity. Most of us are not built for that, which is why the method needs to be a system with meetings and metrics and rituals, because relying on individual courage to do it is relying on the wrong thing. And there is something quietly humane in the underlying motive. Ries keeps returning to waste, not waste as an accounting line, but waste as human effort poured into things that turned out not to matter. Years of people's working lives, their ambition and skill and evenings, spent building products that nobody wanted, when a 2-week experiment could have redirected all of it toward something real. The method is, in the end, an argument that we can be wrong more cheaply, and that being wrong cheaply is not a lesser form of success. It is what makes the eventual success possible. If you take one thing from this, before your next significant build, write down the single assumption that, if false, makes the whole thing pointless. Then ask what the fastest, cheapest, least dignified way to test it would be. If the answer makes you slightly uncomfortable, you have probably found the right experiment.